The bell did not ring for me. I want that understood before anything else, because every man who tells you about the Sunwell begins with the wonder and ends with the woman, and I mean to tell it in the order it happened to me. I stood under 6 tons of silent bronze on my crowning day with my hand raised, and my vow said correctly, word for word, in front of 400 people, and the Sunwell bell hung above me like a held breath and did not make a sound. 400 people heard nothing. That is a strange thing to survive. There is no sound quite like 400 people all deciding at the same instant not to look at each other. Keeper Emil's face did not change. He had known it would not ring. He had watched it not ring for my father and for my grandfather before that, and he was 71 years old and had made his peace with being the man who put a circlet on a dead note. He put it on me and said, "Talvin has a king," and the terraces cheered because they had been told to, and I walked down the chalk stair with my hand starting to itch. Itch is the wrong word. It is what everyone says because there is no right word. It is not pain. It is the feeling of a thing arriving. By the bottom step there was a coin of bronze in my palm, not on it, in it. Skin gone to metal, cool as a well stone, the size of a thumbnail, with the whorl of my own thumbprint still standing proud on the surface of it, perfectly reproduced, as if something had taken a careful cast of me. That is how the Sunwell takes its debt. It has been taking it for 106 years, one king at a time, and it does not hurry, and it does not negotiate. 6 years later, the bronze had reached my elbow. I am going to tell you about those 6 years, because the songs skip them, and the songs are wrong to. If you do not know what the metal is, you will not understand why I went up that hill with soldiers, and I would rather you thought me desperate than cruel. My father went silent at 41. He was a good king and a cold man, and I loved him without ever once being comfortable in a room with him. The bronze took him faster than it took me. It was at his shoulder by 36, and after the shoulder it goes inward, and after inward there is only the one thing left it wants. Nobody knows why it wants the voice. Sar the founder has a theory that a bell is a throat, and a throat is what it is owed. I think that is poetry pretending to be metallurgy. But the fact stands. It goes for the arm, and then the shoulder, and then the words. He lost them over about 9 months, not all at once. First the long ones, then the ordinary ones, then his own name, then mine. Toward the end he would come into my study of an evening and sit down opposite me with a piece of paper and write, and pass it across, and wait while I read it and take it back and write again, and we had more true conversation in that last year on paper than we had in the 20 before it. I have the papers. I have all of them. They are in a box, and I do not open it more than once a year. The last one is not profound. It says, "Tell Emil the North Road tender is a swindle. Also, I am glad you are not afraid of me." At the very end, he could not hold a pen either, and he would look at me and work his mouth and nothing would come, and his eyes would go furious. My father's eyes were the only part of him the metal never got, and I would sit there and hold his bronze hand in my 2 live ones and say, "I know, I know, I know," which was a lie, and he knew it was a lie, and he let me tell it anyway. He died at 44. The physicians wrote long illness. Talvin is very good at writing long illness. So when it started in my own palm at 21, I did what any young man does. I went to war with it. The first year was gloves. Every glove in the royal wardrobe, and then gloves made for me, and then gloves made by a man in the Low Country who swore he had a wool that would hold heat against anything. It does not hold heat against that. There is nothing to hold. It is not that the bronze is cold. It is that the bronze is not warm, which is a different thing entirely, and one you only learn by lying awake at 3 in the morning with your own hand on your chest feeling nothing come back. The first year was also hot baths. I am not proud of the hot baths. I would sit in water hot enough to scald a pig with my arm under it up to the elbow and take it out, and it would be exactly the temperature of a stone in a cellar, and I would put it back in. I did that for 4 months. My valet, who was 19 and terrified of me, used to leave the door open behind him so somebody would find me if I did something stupid. I found out about that 8 years later. I have since made him keeper of the household, which is either gratitude or revenge, and he has never asked which. The second year was physicians, 11 of them. One cut a piece of it out. I want to be careful here because it is the part people ask about at dinner, and it is not a dinner story. He was a good surgeon from the coast, and he had a reasonable theory, which was, it is a substance, and substances can be excised. He took a section the size of a walnut out of my forearm with my full consent, and I watched him do it, because I was 23 and stupid and wanted to see the thing lose. It did not bleed. There is nothing in there to bleed. He lifted out a piece of dull green gold and set it in a dish, and we all looked at it. And there was a hole in my arm with clean bronze at the bottom of it like the floor of a mold. And we stood in that room in complete silence for about 10 seconds feeling, I will admit it, triumphant. Then it filled in, over the next hour. Not healed, filled. It came up out of the bottom of the cavity, the way water finds a level, and by supper my arm was exactly as it had been, and the piece in the dish had gone the color and weight of ordinary bronze scrap, and the surgeon sat down on the floor of my chamber and put his head in his hands. I kept the piece. It is in the box with the papers. The third year was the founders, and the founders were the first people who ever told me anything true, though I did not hear it properly for another 3. Thomas Sar came up from the yards with his hands full of chalk and his sleeves rolled and looked at my arm for a long time and did not touch it and did not flinch and said, "That's bell bronze, Majesty. That's not a curse thing. That's tin and copper in the right proportion. Somebody's short a casting." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means the bell isn't finished." And then he said the thing I did not understand for 3 more years. "You'll never ring it while it's full mined. Smoke the hive, cut the comb. Then at least you'll know what you've got." That was the plan I hated. It was the only plan anyone had. 4 times in 4 years he brought it to me, and 4 times I said no, because there is a thing in this country about the bell hive. I should explain it because it is not sentiment. 106 years is a long time for wild bees to hold one nest, and they have held it. The Sunwell hive is not a hive. It is a piece of geology. The whole shoulder and throat of that bell is packed solid with comb, black as tar at the top where it has been rendered by a century of summer heat in a bronze oven, going down through amber to pale gold at the lip. And there are Hala counted, and Hala does not exaggerate, something over 100,000 of them in there in a good year. Every lavender terrace on that upland is worked by the daughters of that bell. Every founder's yard, every honey house, every hive on the chalk was cast off it at some point in the last century. The upland is 100 miles of purple, and it is purple because of what lives inside that bronze. And there is a coombe. There has always been a coombe. A woman on Kelly's Hill who keeps the bell hive and is not asked to explain herself to anybody, and the crown does not tax it and does not touch it, and that arrangement is older than my family's claim to the throne. So smoke it out, kill 100,000, break the oldest quiet agreement in Tolvain and possibly still not ring the bell. I said no 4 times. Then the metal reached my elbow, and I turned 27, which is 14 years younger than my father was when he stopped talking. And one morning in the spring assize, I could not find the word tributary and stood in front of my own council with my mouth open for 4 seconds. 4 seconds, nobody said anything. It came back. I got through the session. I went up the hill in the summer. I brought 11 men because I am my father's son, and because I thought, God forgive the arrogance of it, that it would be easier for everyone if I made it look like an order rather than a choice. Marshal Davik, Sar, 9 of the guard, smoke pots, veils, saws, a plan on paper. You have never seen a country like the Tolvain uplands unless you have stood in it. White cliff, white road, white dust on everything, and over the top of it 100 miles of lavender in ridged terraces going purple to the horizon like water dyed for a festival. The wind never stops. The bees never stop. From the high road you can hear the whole upland humming under the wind like a note somebody struck a long time ago and never let die. And above it all on Kelly's Hill, the belfry, chalk and pale timber, open on 4 sides, and the Sunwell inside it, green-black with age, dumb as a stone since my great-grandfather's day. There was a woman standing in the arch. She had a canvas apron on and wax to the wrist and a wire in her teeth, and she took the wire out of her teeth and looked at 11 armed men and their king and said, "No." Davik said, "Move aside for the king of Tolvain." She said, "I know who he is. The answer is still no." Then, to me, not to him, "You'll kill them for nothing. That bell won't ring because of what's inside the metal, not what's inside the mouth. Everybody up here knows that. Somebody should have told you before you rode all this way in that coat." 11 men went absolutely still. I have had 2 assassination attempts, and neither of them made a silence like that one. And my bronze went warm. I need you to understand what that meant, so I will be plain about it. In 6 years, that metal had never once been anything but cold. I had put it in scalding water and in a forged glove and against my own chest under 3 blankets in a Talvin winter, and it took my father's warmth out of him inch by inch, and it never gave any of it back, and it had never, not for 1 second, been anything but the temperature of a coin left out overnight. Standing in that arch, with 100,000 bees roaring in the bronze over my head, and a woman with wire in her hand telling me no, my dead metal went warm from the elbow down like water running into a dry pipe. I did not know what it was. I want to be honest about the man I was that morning. I thought I was having a fit. I thought this was the shoulder arriving early. I put my hand on the chalk to hold myself up. She saw it, of course she saw it. She had spent her life watching things nobody else looks at. "Sit down," she said, "before you fall on my hives." I sat down. The king of Talvin sat down on a chalk step because a lavender cutter told him to, and 11 men watched, and that is the first true thing I ever did on Kelly's Hill. Her name was Halakum. She was 31. Her grandmother had kept the Bell Hive, and her grandmother's grandmother back and back to before the silence, and she was not impressed by me and did not pretend to be, and when I asked her what she meant about what's inside the metal, she wiped her hands and said, "Come back when you're not bringing soldiers," and went back to work. Davik wanted to arrest her. He said so on the ride down, carefully, twice. I said, "For what?" He said, "For being right in front of the men, Majesty." Which was honest of him, and is the reason I have never replaced him. I came back in 4 days. I want to say something now about how this went, because I have heard the songs they make of it in the low country, and the songs are cowards. They have me nobly suffering and her nobly waiting. They have the 2 of us finding each other slowly, tenderly, like 2 people who had all the time in the world. I had 6 years of arm and a father who died with his mouth working, and 4 seconds in the spring a size where I could not find a word a child knows. I did not have time and I did not have dignity. I pursued her openly, badly, from the 4th day, and half of Talvin watched me do it. I came back without soldiers. I came back in a plain coat, and got told the plain coat was worse. "You look like a man in a costume of a man," she said. "Wear your own clothes. Everybody knows who you are, Oren. You're the only person on this hill who thinks it's a secret." I asked her to teach me the hives. She said no. I asked again the next week. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I have perhaps 3 years of speech left, and I would like to spend some of them here." She stood with the smoker in her hand for a long moment, and I watched a woman do arithmetic that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what she was willing to be responsible for. Then she handed me the smoker and said, "You'll be useless." I was useless. I was useless for 6 weeks, and I would like the record to show exactly how useless, because it is the only part of my life I am wholly without shame about. Week 1, I got the smoker wrong. There's a way of it: cool smoke, thin, a few puffs at the entrance, and then wait, and I did not wait. I never waited. I pumped that thing like a man putting out a house fire and drove hot smoke into a colony that had done nothing to me. She took it out of my hands and said, "You're not fumigating them, you're telling them there's a grass fire. They'll go and fill up on honey and stop caring about you. That's all it is. It's a rumor, not a weapon." And then she said, "You do that a lot, I expect, overdo the rumor." Week 2, I dropped a frame of brood. I have knocked a man off a horse at the gallop. I have held a line at the Vesson Ford for 2 hours. I picked up a frame of brood, a slab of capped comb the size of a book, 8,000 unborn bees in it, warm as a living body, because it is a living body, and my bronze hand did not know how much it was holding, because bronze does not tell you anything, and the frame went out of my grip and onto the chalk and broke. I stood there. I could not move. It was, at that point, the single worst thing I had ever done with my hands. She knelt down and looked at it and said, "Right," and picked up the 2 halves and got wire and a spare frame and sat down on an upturned skep and rebuilt it. It took her 40 minutes. She lashed the broken comb into the frame like a woman splinting a leg and put it back in the box and said, "They'll fix the rest by Thursday. They're better at it than either of us." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "Don't be sorry, be slower." And then, without looking up, "You can't feel it, so you have to look, that's all. Your eyes work." Nobody had ever said that to me. In 6 years, not one physician, not one founder, not one priest, not one of my own family. They had all said how terrible and how brave and what a cross to bear. She said, "Your eyes work, use them, hold it lighter." Week 4, the stings. I had been going into the hives without a veil. because she did not wear one and I have a great deal of vanity, and had recently been told my coat was a costume. That was fine for 4 weeks. In the 5th week we opened a colony that was queenless and furious. She told me it would be. She told me to put the veil on. I said I would be fine, and they went for me. 91 stings. She counted them out loud while she pulled them, sitting on the step in the white dust with my head tipped back and my eyes swelling shut, scraping each one sideways out of my skin with the edge of her knife. Because if you pinch it, you squeeze the rest of the venom in, and somewhere around 40 she started laughing. It was not cruel laughter. I want that clear. It was the laughter of a woman who had told a king to wear a veil and been ignored, sitting in the wreckage of exactly the outcome she had predicted, holding his head still with one hand. I said through a mouth that was going to be twice its size by evening, "You said 91. You've been counting since the start." She said, "I count everything. It's the job." And I sat there in the chalk dust with my face closing up and 40,000 bees still shouting in the box behind us and my eyes streaming. And I was happier than I had been since my father could talk. Her grandmother was called Nesta. She had been dead 11 years and she was still, in every practical sense, running that hill. Hala quoted her the way soldiers quote drill. Nesta said a hive that swarms is a hive that's happy. Nesta said never trust a man who's kind to the bees and rude to the dog. Nesta said the combs don't keep the bell hive keeps the combs. And Nesta, at 60, had gone up the ladder and stood in the mouth of the sunwell and said her vow, and the bell had not rung. Hala told me that in the 6th week, not as tragedy, as data. She'd been thinking about it for years, she said. She had it all worked out. She went up on a midsummer and said a true thing, and it was true. I've no doubt it was true. My grandmother never said a false word to anyone in her life. And nothing. She came down and made supper and never mentioned it again. I only know because I was 9 and I was watching from the terrace. I said, then it can't be done. She said, then it can't be done like that, which is not the same sentence, and I did not notice at the time. The upland watched all of this. I want to be honest about that, too. I did not court her in private. There is no private on the chalk. You can see 11 miles from Kelly's Hill and 11 miles can see you. The cutters on the terraces watched the King of Talvin get stung 91 times. The founders in the low yards heard about the brood frame within a day. Old Marisar, Toma's mother, sold me a jar of honey in the market at Wend and charged me double, and told me to my face she was charging me double, for the entertainment. They did not resent it. That was the strange part. I had expected resentment, a king up here buzzing round a coombe. What I got was something much worse, which was that the whole upland relaxed. Somewhere in that summer they collectively decided that whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and they went back to work. And that was more frightening than opposition, because it meant they knew something about the shape of it that I did not. She told me about the metal in the 7th week. We were rendering wax. That is a filthy, sticky, wonderful job, and it goes on for hours, and you cannot look at each other because you are both looking at a pot, which is, I have come to believe, the only condition under which anyone in my family has ever said anything true. Here is what the founders in my capital did not know, and every child on the chalk did. A bell rings because it is honest. That is not a poem, that is bronze. A bell is cast around a wax model, the exact shape of the bell in wax over a core and the mold built up around that, and then the wax is melted out, run away to nothing, and what is left is a void in the precise shape of the thing you want. Then you pour, and the metal must go everywhere the wax went, everywhere, into every curve of the shoulder, every letter of the inscription band, down to the lip and around and up. If there is one bubble, one place where the air did not get out and the metal did not get in, one lie in the pour, the bell will hang there beautiful and dead and never make a true note as long as it exists. Founders call it a held breath. You cannot fix it. You cannot fill it. You can only break the bell up and pour it again. And 106 years ago, Hala said, stirring, King Havard Vale stood under a new bell on his crowning day and swore Talvin came before everything in his heart. I said, I know the vow. I said the vow. He'd already promised his heart, she said, 8 months earlier up on this chalk to a woman who kept the hives. I stopped stirring. She kept going, evenly, as if she were telling me about a wet spring in a bad year. Her name was Erie Coombe. Havard came up the chalk at 24 before he was king, the way princes do, hunting in that coat being no secret to anybody, and he stood in that arch and asked her to teach him the hives. and she said he'd be useless, and he was. Hala let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. Yes, she said, I know. Everybody up here knows. That's why nobody's resenting you, Oren. They're all just waiting to see if you've got the wit to do it differently. I said, what did he do? He promised her. 8 months in, on the shortest night, under the bell that was still being cast down in the yards, he promised Eerie Coombe that she came before everything, and he meant it entirely with his whole heart, and that is the crucial thing and the thing every version of the story gets wrong. He was not lying. If he had been lying, it would have been fine. A lie has no weight. A lie is not a promise, it is a noise. He meant it. And then his father died in the winter, and he went down off the chalk. And 8 months later, he stood in a new belfry in front of 400 people and swore, meaning it entirely, that Talvin came before everything in his heart. Both true, both first, neither would move. He booked his word twice for the same hour, Hala said. And then he stood under 6 tons of bronze and offered it a vow with a hole in the middle of it, and the metal heard a held breath. The wax went on turning in the pot. It didn't punish him, she said. That's what the low country gets wrong. It's not a punishment, there's no judge, it's a bubble. He put a held breath in it, and now the metal's short, and metal that's short takes what it's owed. Yours is bronze, your father's was bronze. Havard's was bronze. The bell is trying to finish casting itself out of you. I sat with that for a while, with the wind coming over the ridge and 40,000 bees working the lavender under it. I said, what happened to Eerie? She kept the hive, Hala said. 42 more years, never married, never went down off the chalk. She lifted the pot off the heat. He came up twice more, she wouldn't see him. Not out of spite, Nesta was very clear about that, and Nesta got it from her own mother, who got it from Eerie direct. She wouldn't see him because she'd worked out what he'd done to himself, and she reckoned every hour she gave him made the hole bigger. She was protecting the metal from him. That's the sort of thing a Coombe does. I said, that's the sort of thing you'd do. She said, don't be clever, hand me the muslin. But her ears had gone red, and I saw it, and I have never in my life been so pleased about anything. I said, so somebody says a true vow under it, and it rings, and it's paid. And she stopped straining. 19 people have tried, she said. Since the silence, priests, founders, 2 of your aunts, a general, my grandmother. Every one of them had something standing behind them when they spoke, a house, an oath, a king, a debt, a family. The bell doesn't want a good vow, Oren, it wants an only one. It's been 106 years, and nobody in this country has ever come up that hill with their word free. That was the first time she used my name. She did not notice she had done it. I noticed. I noticed the way a drowning man notices a rope. The council found out in the 8th week, which was 7 weeks longer than I expected. They did not shout. Talvin's council does not shout, it schedules. There was an item on the order paper, item 11, under the succession, and I saw it at breakfast and knew exactly what my day was going to be. Davik laid it out at the long table with his hands flat and his voice level, and he did it well, and I have never been angrier at anyone in my life for doing something well. The bronze was at my elbow. The physicians gave me 2 years to the shoulder and perhaps a year from shoulder to silence. That is the family pattern, and my father had held to it within 4 months. A silent king cannot ratify, cannot judge, cannot speak the spring assize, and the assize is not a ceremony, it is the mechanism by which 40,000 people in the low country find out whether they are being robbed. My father's last 2 assizes were read by a proxy, and the North Road tender was a swindle, and there is a village called Hendry that is still poor because of it. You know this, Majesty, Davik said. You told me about the tender yourself. Then he said the rest. My cousin Siriad Vale, 34, sound, decent, married, 2 daughters, and this was said gently because they are not cruel men unmarked. Abdicate at the turn of the year, Davik said. Go up your hill, keep your bees, nobody will think less of you. Talvin will bless you for it and mean it. And I looked down that table at 11 honest faces and understood, at last and completely, the shape of the thing that had been killing my family for 3 generations. I said, say the rest of it. Davik said, Majesty. Say the rest of it, Marshal. Siriad goes under the bell. He says the vow, and the bell doesn't ring. And it starts in his palm in front of 400 people, the same as it started in mine and my father's and my grandfather's. And in 6 years his arm is bronze, and in 12 years his daughters are sitting where we are sitting having this exact conversation about his cousin. I could hear my own voice going and could not do anything about it. That is not a succession, Davik. That is a queue. Nobody spoke. That is what it's been doing to us, I said. You all think it takes the king. It doesn't take the king, it takes the line. It is a debt passed down a family like a bad tooth, and every one of us has stood there and paid our arm into it and called it duty, and you are asking me to hand my cousin the bill. Keeper Emile, 77 by then, and he had put the circlet on 3 men and watched 3 bells not ring, said, very quietly, "It has always been so, Majesty." I said, 106 years is not always. It is 106 years. My great-grandfather was a young man once, and this hill was quiet. I went to Siriad myself that evening, because I was not going to let him hear it in a room. He was in his own yard with a horse, and he listened to the whole thing without saying anything, and then he said, "You'd have made me do it, wouldn't you? If you'd been 41 and gone, you'd have written it in a letter, and I'd have done it." I said, "Yes." He said, "So would I have, to you." He put the brush down. "That's the trouble with decent men, Oren will queue for anything." I told him I had asked the council for until the shortest night. I told him that if it failed, he would have the crown clean at the turn of the year. From my own hand, no argument, and I gave him my word on it. And my word was worth something to him, because at that point it was still the only part of me that was not going gray. He asked one question. He is a better man than the songs bother to say, and this is why. He said, "Does she know what it costs if it works?" I said, "Nobody knows what it costs if it works. It's never worked." He said, "Then you'd better be standing under it with her." I rode up the chalk that evening in the dark, which you should not do, and told her all of it, standing in her doorway with my horse blowing behind me. She listened the whole way through. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Sit down, you're gray," and put bread in front of me and sat opposite with her chin on her hand and thought for a while. Then she said, "There's a crack in the belfry footing." I said, "What?" "There's a spring come up under the North Pier. It's been eating the chalk 2 years. Tomasar surveyed it in the spring and told your keeper, and your keeper told him the belfry has stood 400 years. She turned her cup around. "It'll go in a winter or 2, maybe this one if it's wet. And when it goes, that bell goes off the hill and into the terraces, and no one is ever ringing it again." The room was very quiet. "Then the debt never gets paid," I said. "Then the debt never gets closed," she said. "It doesn't stop, it just stops having a bell to be paid into." She looked up. "Your grandson's palm, Oren, and his." I put my hands over my face. One warm, one cold as a coin. She said, "I'll do it." I took my hands down. She was not being dramatic. She has never been dramatic in her life. She said it the way she says it'll rain Thursday, a woman reporting a fact she had already checked twice. "On the shortest night I'll cut the comb out," she said. "Cold night the hives clustered, I can take the whole thing down clean and not lose a frame of them. I've got the empty skeps ready since midsummer. I've been ready since midsummer. I just wanted to see if you'd ask." A short breath. "You didn't ask, that's the only reason I'm offering." "Halla." And then I'll say a true thing under it. "It takes a price," I said. 19 people. 19 people got told no, she said. "There's no record of the bell taking one thing off any of them. Not a finger, not an hour. That's your council talking, not the metal. The metal doesn't want blood, Oren, it wants paying. You lot have just never had anything to pay it with." I said, "And you do." And Halakum looked at me across her own table with the wax on her hands and said, "I've got no house. I've got no oath. I've got no debt to any man in this country and no claim on me but my own. My grandmother's dead, my mother's dead. I've no husband, no children, no lord, no guild. There's nobody standing behind me." She shrugged slightly. "I'm the only person in Talvin who's free. It'd be a stupid thing to be free and not spend it." I said her name. I could not manage anything else. "You can say no," she said. "But you'd be saying it to save me from a bell, and I've kept that hive since I was 9, and it has never once hurt me." I did not sleep between then and the shortest night, and I did not spend those weeks being noble. I spent them fighting a spring. That is the part nobody sings, and it is the part I am proudest of. There is no wonder in it at all. There is only 40 men and Tomasar and 11 weeks of the most miserable engineering ever attempted in this country. And if it had failed, the bell would have gone down the hill in February, and everything else in this story would be a footnote about a king who went mad on a chalk ridge. The North Pier of the Sunwell Belfry sits on chalk. Chalk is a sponge that has agreed, temporarily, to be a rock. A spring had come up under the northeast corner. Nobody's fault, no villain, just water that had been thinking about it for 10,000 years. And it had washed out a void under that pier that Tsar measured at 4 feet across and could not measure the depth of, because he could not get a rod to the bottom of it. 6 tons of bronze, on a timber frame, on a pier standing on a hole. We went at it in November and December, in Talvin wind, on a hill with no shelter on it anywhere. First we had to find where the water was going, because you cannot fill a void that is being drained. Tsar took 11 days over that with a set of colored dyes and a great deal of swearing, and found the outfall on a cliff terrace half a mile north, 40 feet down a face, and we cut a drain to take the water off before it reached the pier at all. That is a trench, by hand, through chalk in December, 300 yards long, and I dug in it. I want that on the record because Davik told me it was theater, and it was not theater. It was that I had one live arm and one arm that could not feel a blister, and a man who cannot feel a blister can dig for a very long time. Then we filled rubble and lime grout, barrow by barrow, down a shaft into a hole we could not see the bottom of, and it swallowed everything we gave it for 4 days and gave nothing back. And on the 5th day Tsar put his hand on the frame and said, "She's taking," and we went on for 11 more. Then we shored. Every timber in the royal yard came up that hill on wagons. The road is not for wagons. We lost 2 and a horse and a man's foot, and I paid the man's pension out of my own household, and he lives in Wend now and will not let me buy him a drink. And on the 9th of December the wind came round to the north, and it rained for 2 days, and the northeast corner moved. Half an inch, that is all. Half an inch at the top, where the frame meets the crown of the bell, and you could see it if you stood in the arch and looked up, and the whole thing made a noise like a ship. 40 men stood in the mud in the dark and looked at me. I said, "Tsar." And Toma Tsar, 60 years old, wringing wet, who had told my keeper about this spring in the spring and been told the belfry had stood 400 years, said the finest thing anyone said to me in that entire year. He said, "It's not falling tonight, Majesty, it's just complaining. Get the men under cover and I'll want 20 more timbers by Thursday." He got them by Wednesday. It held, it is still holding. The drain runs to this day, and there is a man paid to walk it, and that is the single most useful thing I have ever done with the Crown's money. The shortest night came in still and hard and starry, which is the coldest kind we get. Half the upland came up Kelly's Hill without being asked. That is the part the songs get right, and I will not pretend it did not undo me. They came with lanterns along the terrace paths from every ridge, hundreds of them, purple-black hills with a crawling line of light, cutters and founders and grandmothers, Marasar with her stick, the man from Wend with his 1 foot, and nobody had summoned them and nobody said much of anything. They just came up and stood in the lavender and waited, because a coom was going into the bell. She went up the ladder at midnight with a knife and a lantern, and no smoke at all. "Cold hive, clustered tight," she said. "They ball up when it's below freezing, 60,000 of them holding a fist of heat around their queen, and they do not come apart for anything. And if you are gentle and you are in the dark and you do not shake them, they will never know you were there. You do it by hand. You do it slowly. You do it in the dark because a lantern in the wrong place will wake the outside of the cluster, and then they will fly in air that will kill them, and that is a thing you cannot take back." She was in the throat of that bronze for 2 hours and 11 minutes. I know because I counted. I count things now. I stood underneath and watched a woman's boots and the edge of her lantern light moving in the mouth of the sunwell, and she handed the comb down piece by piece into my hands, my 2 hands, the cold one and the warm one, 106 years of it, and I passed it to Tsar, and Tsar passed it down the line, and the line went out of the belfry and down the terrace, and 1,100 people passed 106 years of honeycomb hand to hand in the dark and stacked it in a wagon. Black at the shoulder, hard as slate, comb that had been rendered and re-rendered by a century of summers in a bronze oven until it was more mineral than wax. Then amber. Then at the lip pale gold this year's, soft, heavy as a child, warm as bread, smelling of every summer this hill has ever had. At one point she said, from inside the metal, in a voice that came out of that bell like the bell was speaking, "Orin, there's writing in here." Nobody had seen the inside of the Sunwell's shoulder in 106 years. She scraped it and read it out, and it was not a prophecy, and it was not a curse. It was the founder's mark and the date, and underneath in the small hand founders use for the things that are for nobody, poured true. B. Sar. Toma Sar, standing next to me with his arms full of comb, made a sound I will not describe. His great-great-grandfather had poured that bell true. The bell was fine. The bell had always been fine. It was cast correctly by an honest man on an honest day, and there was never one bubble in that metal, and the held breath went into it 8 months later, in a belfry out of a mouth. Hala came down last with the cluster itself in a skep against her chest, 60,000 bees breathing in a ball, and she carried them off to the leeward side and set them down out of the wind and covered them and stood a moment with her hand on the straw. Then she came back to the belfry and looked up into the bell. It was empty, clean bronze. 106 years of held breath, and above it, the mouth of the thing open at last like a throat that had just remembered what it was for. She was gray with cold. There was wax in her hair. Her hands had gone the color of the chalk. I have never in my life seen anything to touch her. She said, "Get out from under it." I said, "No." "Orend." "I have been under it since I was 21, I said. "If it takes something tonight, it can take it off me. That is the one thing I have to give, and I am not moving." And Halakum looked at me for a long moment, and then, out in front of 1,100 of her own people, my grave and blunt and unhurried woman started laughing at me and put her cold hand flat against my chest and said, "You never learn." Then she looked up into the bronze and stopped laughing and said it. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She has told me since that she had a speech worked out, 3 weeks of it on paper in her own hand with the good phrases underlined, and that standing in that arch she forgot every word of it and just said the true thing, which is the only reason it worked, and I believe her because I have seen the paper. She kept it. It is in the box now with my father's. She said, "I want the man, not the crown, not the kingdom, not the bell. Nobody sent me and nobody's standing behind me, and there's nothing in me but this. I want him." And the Sunwell rang. I have been asked to describe the sound, and I cannot, and I have stopped apologizing for it. It came from the metal, and it came from the hill. It went through my ribs before it reached my ears. The chalk of Kelly's hill rang. I felt the ground do it through my boots, that whole white bone of a hill sounding like the inside of a struck cup. And the lavender terraces to the horizon shook their dead winter stalks and made a sound like rain. And 1,100 people put their hands over their mouths, and not one of them cheered, because you do not cheer at that. It is not a cheering thing. It is the note the world was built out of, and somebody finally let it out. And my arm ran. It ran like water. 6 years of bronze from elbow to fingertip came off me in one long liquid pull, off my skin and up against the world, in a thread of dull green gold, up into the mouth of the bell. And behind it came the rest, and I saw it. Everybody there saw it. My father's bronze and my grandfather's bronze and Havard's bronze coming up out of the chalk of that hill in 100 bright threads like roots pulling. 106 years of collected debt going home into the metal. It came out of the ground. It came out of 3 graves. It came up the hill from the low country in threads too fine to see except where the lantern light caught them, and the bell rang and rang and rang and took every piece of it back. I felt my hand for the first time in 6 years. I felt the cold. I felt the wind on it, and it hurt, and I have never been so glad of anything. I felt her palm, still flat on my chest, and it was the first thing my true skin ever touched, and I went down on my knees in the chalk dust, and I did not get up for some while. Somewhere out past the arch, in the dark, my wolf came back to me. He had been under the metal the whole time. 6 years of a locked door, not gone, never gone, shut, which is worse. A live thing on the other side of a door with no handle. And then it was open, and he went out of that belfry and down 1,100 lanterns worth of hillside in a gray streak, and he ran the terraces until dawn. And every wolf on the chalk went with him, and the people stood in the lavender and let them through and never made a sound. I stayed on my knees with my forehead against her apron. The bell was still ringing. Then it cracked. One long tearing note from lip to crown, and the sound went out of it like breath out of a man. And the Sunwell of Talvain, 6 tons, 400 years, 106 of them silent, hung there in the dark with a split in it you could put your arm through, and was finished. Paid in full, that is what the founders say. A bell that is paid does not need to ring twice. The cost came in the morning, and it came for me exactly as I had asked. Keeper Emil found it first, because he was the only man on that hill thinking about anything but breakfast. He was 77, and he had been awake all night, and he went up the ladder himself, which I would have forbidden if anyone had asked me, and he came down white. The vow line had gone with the crack. I should explain what that is. Inside the shoulder of the sunwell, cast in a great band all the way round, were the words of the vow, the true text, the original, the one every Vale king has been sworn against since the bell was hung 400 years ago. Not a copy. The original. There is no other. Talvin's law is not written in a book. It is a shape in metal, and the words in the book are a transcript of the shape, and the shape is the thing. And the crack went through it, lip to crown, straight through the letters, splitting the band in 2 places. There is no law in this country older than that band, and no crown in this country that was ever anything but the sound of it. The kingship of the Vales was bound in that metal, cast into it, 400 years ago, by men who wanted a thing no king could rewrite. When the metal broke, so did the binding. I was not king by right anymore. I was not king by blood. There was, as of about 2 o'clock that morning, no mechanism in the world by which I was king of anything at all, and the whole apparatus of it, the assize, the tithe, the levies, the courts, 400 years of it, was suddenly resting on nothing whatsoever except 1,100 cold people standing on a hill looking at me. Davik went white as well. Siriad laughed out loud once and then apologized, and I have never held it against him because it was, objectively, very funny. I stood up in the wreck of it with my own 2 hands, and my wolf out somewhere in the lavender, and Hala beside me with wax in her hair, and I found that I was not afraid. Keeper Emil said, "Majesty, we can recast the band. Sar can take the text from the transcript. It is a month's work. Nobody need ever." I said no. He said, "Majesty, without it there is no." "I know what there is," I said. "Ask me." Davik said, "Majesty." "No," I said. "That's finished. That word was cast in a bell, and the bell is broken, and I will not have another one poured to hold it. My great-grandfather was king by metal. He never had to be right about anything in his life. He never had to be asked. He stood under 6 tons of guarantee and told it his heart was undivided when it was not, and the guarantee is exactly what let him get away with it, and it has been coming out of his family's arms for 106 years. I looked out at the lanterns going gray in the dawn. So ask me. Every spring at the assize, out loud, in front of the low country, and if the answer is no, I'll go up the hill and keep bees and Siriad can have it and be asked the same question the year after. They asked me that spring. They have asked me every spring since. Twice it has been close. Once, the year of the Hendry compensation, when I was right and unpopular and the 2 are not friends. It went to a second day, and I sat in a room and listened to a farmer from the North Road tell 400 people exactly what he thought of the Vales for 2 hours, and every word of it was true. And I have never in my life been so glad my father's papers were in a box where I could get at them. I have found, to my considerable surprise, that a man who has to be asked is a better king than a man who was cast. I have found that Talvin has cost me more in argument in these 11 years than the bronze ever cost me in arm. That is the correct price, and I would pay it again tomorrow. That is what the bell took. It took the guarantee. It has never touched her, not once. It never asked her for anything, and it never will, and I have made that my life's work, and the day it does I will break the new one myself. There is a new bell on Kelly's Hill. It took 2 years. Sar broke the sunwell up, that was a bad week, and he would not let anyone else swing the hammer, and poured it again from its own metal, every ounce of it, the same bronze, the same tin and copper in the right proportion, my father in there and my grandfather in there, and Havard in there and my own 6 years in there. And a bell is cast around wax, as I told you, and there is only one place in this country the wax comes from. So the new bell of Talvin was shaped out of 106 years of comb that a woman handed down into my hands piece by piece in the dark, rendered in her own pot on her own hill, over a winter, in a job so long and so filthy that I stopped counting the days at 90. Her wax, her hive, every summer since Erie Coombe was young, melted out and gone the way wax always goes, and the bronze standing exactly where it said to stand. Not one bubble in the pour. Sar wept. He is 60 and he wept into his sand and told me he would never make another one, and he has not. And there is a line inside the shoulder in a small hand that says the same 4 words his great-great-grandfather wrote, and under it, because I made him. And B. Sar was right the first time. They wanted a coronation under it. I said no. There is nothing to swear on any more, and I would not build one, and besides, it is not that kind of bell. The people put the hive back in the shoulder within a month anyway, different bees, the old cluster's daughters, straight up the ladder and in as if the last 106 years had been a small inconvenience. It rings all right with them in there. Not as bright. Nobody minds. Here is where I leave it. Every shortest night, the two of us climb Kelly's Hill in the dark with a lantern, alone, no lanterns on the terraces, nobody asked and nobody told. She checks her cluster, hand flat on the straw, listening, the way her grandmother did, the way Erie did. I stand under the bronze with my two plain hands, and when she is finished, I ring it once myself. I ring it badly. I have never once got a clean note out of it, and I have been doing this for 11 years. Hala stands in the arch with her arms folded and does not help me and does not say anything, and the bad note goes out over the black lavender, and the whole white hill hums it back at us, wrong, and the bees do not so much as stir, because after everything, after the metal and the council and the spring under the North Pier and the 91 stings, and the 2 hours she spent inside that bell in the cold and the dark with her hands full of every summer this hill has ever had. They have never once thought I was worth waking up for. And she puts her hand flat on my chest in the dark, the way she did the first time, and says, "You never learn." No, but I got asked. And I said the true thing back.